Welcome back to another week of Power Metal Point. And just to prove I wasn't kidding about the show being about more than just power metal, today we're going to discuss women in metal. So for most fans, it should come as no surprise that metal is hugely a boys' club. I think it's safe to say that the vast majority of metal fans are male, and most of the members comprising metal bands are as well. Let's face it, heavy metal is lewd, it's aggressive, pissed off, and offensive, and in many cases toward women. So what does this mean for women? Are they due largely to feel like outsiders within the genre? Or are the tide shifting as they are in the general population for the advancement of women throughout society? And what about girls who are already fans of metal, or even band members? In this episode, we're going to look at a number of women in metal and what, if anything, can be done to engage the fairer sex more with this genre of music. Before I get into this, realize that I'm going to be making a number of sweeping generalizations about women, and none should be taken as scientific fact. At best, there's a bit of research to back up what I'm saying, and in many cases, only my own individual observations and musings. And also, I'd just like to mention that before you go and light up the YouTube comments talking about how rap treats women so much more horribly, yes, that's absolutely true. I'm not arguing otherwise, but this, again, is going to be about metal. So to start, let's get a bit of perspective on this topic. Until the mid-1980s and the introduction of death metal, most singers in metal emulated Ian Gillan and Rob Halford's vocal style, singing in the high or tenor range. The problem with this is that most guys' voices simply aren't suited to this style. Especially as guys age, it gets harder and harder to get your voice as high as it needs to be to sing the end of Aces High or the opening note of Queen of the Reich. Women's voices, however, as I'm sure you know, are naturally higher than men's, so it seems like they would be perfect candidates as a metal vocalist. But in the 1970s and 80s, being a largely geek genre, metal was largely confined to a young male audience. It was in these early days that female band members often found themselves emulating their male counterparts in regards to the image they presented and their vocal style in order to be taken seriously. Check out Lee Aaron's Metal Queen album from 1984. She's dressed in leather and chains and represents a much tougher masculine exterior than most female singers at the time. Doro Pesch from Warlock did much the same thing. Other bands like Bitch used an ironic name with a female singer, which more than subtly alluded to the male worldview dominance within metal. Though here we can still see Betsy dressed with a tough exterior doused in leather. This perceived mandatory masculinity was such a problem that White Zombie bassist Sean Yasso dressed heavily like a tomboy on stage to obscure revealing her gender in order to be taken seriously. So here we can see women portraying themselves as aggressive, lewd, and powerful within metal, especially in its early days. But with heavy metal's image starting to change thanks to MTV and music videos and metal becoming more in the mainstream in pop culture, sexiness began to be heavily flaunted. Former Runaway lead guitarist Lita Ford is a prime example of this. In her music videos, her sexuality is flaunted first and her incredible voice and finger work on the fretboard is a distant second. Still, we see women as something of objects during this period. As the 1990s trudged on, however, the tides were beginning to turn for the fairer sex in metal. Genres like power, folk, and gothic metal saw women gaining roles as respected musicians and talents within their respective bands alongside males. Women have gradually been able to flaunt their natural femininity and sing like women rather than exhibiting tougher masculine exteriors and singing in raspier, gruffer voices. One of the best examples of this is Nightwish, who feature a classically trained singer named Tara Turunen, and she has been a massive influence on female metal singers ever since. In Nightwish's videos and concert performances, she appears to be taking on a non-sexual and equal role within the band. Likewise, having just watched several videos of Liv Christine of Leaves' Eyes, I can't help but notice that she seems to dance for fun and enjoyment rather than seduction. I'm not terribly familiar with the inner workings of Leaves' Eyes, so I can only comment with casual observations. Some of women's expansion into the metal genre is no doubt due to greater advancements of women in all facets of society. But it also seems that women have taken on greater roles in metal due in part to the internet. Genres like gothic metal remained heavily underground before the internet, but with downloading the instant sharing of information and YouTube, bands have been able to gain new audiences they would have never been able to reach before. Now girls can hear Angela Gassow of Arch Enemy and not only see her as an equal of men within the band, but also as a respected growler in the whole of metal. The same trends are also noticeable with women taking up hobbies into other geek forays, such as going to sci-fi and anime conventions, and you can probably thank Sailor Moon for that. Men are discovering that they can share their passions with their girlfriends, and women are discovering material that caters to them within these genres. Now, this by no means is to say that women have asexualized themselves in metal. Far from it. Let's face it, sex sells. Singers like Christina Scabbia have taken revealing photos, and it's not uncommon for bands to place their sexy singer up front and center in band shots. Likewise, catcalls for female band members to take their shirt off from audience members is not entirely uncommon to female band members. And no doubt this can be hurtful to girls on stage trying to perform. They're playing music and putting on a show, and very few are up there to put on a strip show. So guys, this should go without saying, but do the rest of the metal community a favor, and women in general, and don't ogle female performers like a pervert. Aside from female performers, let's look at one prominent woman in business roles in heavy metal. Other than Sharon Osbourne, one of the lesser known yet very important figures in the underground was Anne Boleyn of Hellion. Aside from fronting a great underground metal band in the late 1980s, she owned New Renaissance Records, which was important in giving bands like Sepultura, Bathory, King Cobra, Morbid Angel, and perhaps my favorite of the bunch, Deadly Blessing, their starts. Sepultura would go on to eventually become one of the biggest metal bands of the early 1990s. So as we can see, women have their place within the music business and bands, but how about as fans? The aggression factor of mosh pits might be a bit of deterrent for women, as a 100-pound girl sadly won't stand any chance against a crowd of 200-pound guys. But how about buying records and spreading the word about bands and just being a casual listener? Well, perhaps we'll never see another time like we did in the late 1980s for women as metal fans. Bands like Poison and Warrant having ballads played on MTV and being a major force in pop culture at the time, women made up a significant portion of metal's audience. When the mainstream culture and 80s teens began to grow up, many of these bands found their audiences had dwindled massively. Yet bands like Iron Maiden with predominantly male audiences still managed to remain reasonably popular over the long haul. Culture and music author Chuck Klosterman offers a rather interesting insight into this phenomenon. He writes that women tend to be much more intense in their fandom for shorter periods of time, particularly in their tweens. In an interview he did with Gene Simmons, Gene argued that bands like Kiss shouldn't look to a largely female fan base because after your glory days are over, the girls have moved on, much as women put away their dolls for good. Men, on the other hand, tend to stick around for the long haul. Buying records for guys, according to Klosterman, is a responsibility. I can only offer my personal account, but as a lifelong Skid Row fan, I've purchased virtually everything they've done, regardless of how good it actually was. Hell, I bought the Last Hard Men album because it featured Sebastian Bach, and I knew full well going into it that it was a piece of crap, but I had to complete my collection. On the whole, men tend to be more completist when it comes to buying and archiving music, although this phenomenon can be found across other things such as movies, computers, tools, all sorts of things. And heaven forbid you give a guy a label maker. Okay, so now what can be done to bring women to the metal? Well, I think it's already underway. With a greater number of young bands incorporating female musicians into their lineups, more and more girls are taking note of what women can achieve in metal. Probably the simplest solution is to send YouTube links of Leaves' Eyes or Epica videos to your girlfriends, sisters, aunts, and any other girls that you know. And then when they finally come around to heavy metal, hound them to keep buying their albums for the next 30 years or so. That's all for this week, and until next time, keep it metal.